Well, welcome. Wanted to share with you all a report we've been working on for over a year. And one of the things that's in front of the Congresses that will follow this one is the tax code. And you hear all sorts of members of Congress say we need to change the tax code. But you never hear them say what specifically we need to change it. So what we tried to do was to go through the entire tax code, almost the entire tax code, and lay out for the American public what each one of these provisions does, who it benefits, and what the effect of it is. One of the underlying principles that I used and had my staff use as we prepared this is to try to recognize when government's trying to influence behavior through the tax code, and whether or not that's appropriate. Also, whether or not we're trying to do social engineering through the tax code, and whether or not that's appropriate. Not in terms of whether we think it's appropriate, but in whether or not the U.S. Constitution says it's appropriate, which should be our guide. So you're going to see some of the areas as you read through this where we have made recommendations, and those are my recommendations. That's what I would be voting for when I was here. They're not necessarily the right recommendation, but what we tried to do was to present a full-fledged development of all the aspects of the tax code, where the money's spent, who benefits, and raise the question that if you benefit a certain group, somebody else is less benefited and therefore must make up for it. And so on balance, we wanted people to be able to go to every section of the tax code and see, here's how much it costs, here's where it's going, here's who's getting it, here's the fraud associated with it, here's the effectiveness of it, and here is what it's trying to do. And also, what we also tried to do is contrast that if you really want to make decisions to try to change behavior, you're much better off doing it with a full-blown federal government program than using the tax code to do it, because you have very little control when you use the tax code. So if you want to really influence behavior and you really want to change things, the best way to do it is to have a government program, not a tax credit or a tax incentive to do it, because there's very little control when it comes to tax. There's a whole lot of fraud and utilization of tactics that were not ever intended as secondary causes. So with that, let me stop and take questions. We're hopeful people will use this in years forward to say, here's where it is, here's what can be done, and basically as a guide, so that people can actually know, and the American people can. Nobody, we're going to spend $250 billion this year paying our taxes, and another $250 billion inside corporate America figuring out ways to get around taxes. So something's obviously, that's $500 billion. Something's obviously wrong, and people know it's wrong. The question is how do you get members of Congress in political dynamic to make hard choices that go against the will of some of their backers, but in the long run will have capital formation reign supreme and growth reign supreme. And that's the real key. If we really want our country to grow, you got to change this tax code. So with that, let me stop and answer any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, not related to this.
Well, let's stay on this first, and then let's stay on this, and then if we have questions other than the tax code, I'd be happy to try to answer them after.
Well, I'm from tax notes,
okay,
so I'm sure you can guess what my question will be
yeah.
about. So your stated objective here is to influence the tax reform process, to inform it. The two gentlemen in the Senate and in the House will be probably taking the lead on that process starting next year. Mr. Ryan and Mr. Hatch, have you spoken to them at all about this?
They knew I was doing this,
but
I haven't given them a pre-up copy. The whole goal is I want to put it, what we tried to do was take a look at what we saw from an individual standpoint, as an individual American would look at this and say, does this seem right? Does this seem fair? I really think it's kind of stupid that we give the NFL main office a tax-exempt charity. I mean, I don't know how many Americans agree with me, and then we pay the guy millions and millions of dollars, but it's through a tax-exempt organization. And the same thing with the PGA. I mean, there's, we got all these 501c3s. I think it's up to 150 or something. Yeah, you have more, and they're so abused, it's unbelievable. In terms of celebrities creating tax-exempt charities and then using them for their own benefit, not to help anybody else but themselves. So I mean, there's just a lot of things we want to change. So the whole purpose was to say, let's look at this as a common sense. You can read this in English and understand this, and the average American can understand it. And it's just to say, what are the issues that are out there?
Well, just following up on that very briefly, how do you hope and expect that this document, which I understood took 2 years to put together, to influence the tax reform process? I mean,
my hope would be that people like you would put it out to the American people, portions of it, so that the American people can actually see that when you advantage one group of people, like the people who buy very fancy, high-efficiency appliances, and one manufacturer gets $300 million worth of tax credit, which is most of their profit the whole year off of that out of the federal government, and only the very rich can buy those, that the people that are down on the bottom end of the income ladder are actually paying for that by paying more taxes than what they would otherwise. Why not let markets decide whether or not you're going to buy a high-efficiency refrigerator, rather than the government decide, and then when the government does decide, it's only the very wealthy that can do that? How is that fair to somebody that's earning $35,000 or $40,000 a year? So what I want to see is the contrast made that where when we want to try to do social policy, what we do is we do it by really helping the high end the most, because they're the ones that can take advantage of it. And they're the ones that need it the least. And so all I'd say is we would like to see those contrasts put out there so that people, you know, the real problem is we need a very simple tax code. We either need a national sales tax or a flat tax. And then we need to treat everybody the same and let markets and capital decide where we'll expand. And if we do that, we'll grow at about 2% more per year. The way we're doing it now, we're never going to do that.
Specifically, what would you say were the most surprising revelations you and your staff found doing this report?
Just the amount of fraud throughout all the intended tax, the inability of the IRS to do their job. That's what I take away. I don't think my staff would say the same thing.
Can you point to anything very specific that you found?
Well, I mean, just look at all the things that they don't look at and see if it's being done right. I mean, the way the IRS works, we'd have to have 250,000 IRS employees. And it's not their fault. You have this completely... You can't find a tax accountant that'll give you the same return on your taxes in this town. You can't. So that should tell us something. And what our tax code should be fair to everybody. And shouldn't advantage anybody. And everybody should participate.
You point out some celebrity charities. Can you talk about those and the problems with them?
Well, I just, you know, when I can't remember which.
Lady Gaga.
Yeah, $5,000 is all she's done through charity. I mean, why? I mean, she you know, that's a tip to her driver going to a concert. I mean, the whole point is I'm not against charitable contributions. I think they're great. And I'm not against having them as a portion of the tax code. But we've so expanded it, and this is not the IRS's fault. This is members of Congress doing things parochially, like you're going to see in this tax extenders package, doing things that benefit either individual members or individual states or individual industries to the benefit of the members of Congress, not necessarily to the benefit of the country as a whole. So you tell me why race car tracks get a super fast depreciation. What I'm for is let's expense everything all at once, right now. Let's don't discriminate. Let's don't pick and choose winners. If you're in a business and you have expenses, get them expensed against your revenue. We're playing this game right now on average tax, on either LIFO or FIFO or average. Well, I have an accounting degree. The whole idea is to match costs with revenues. But we don't do that. We take certain industries and don't do that. So if we're not, let's just let them expense it all. And here's what your expenses were, here's what your revenue is, here's what your tax is. And you know what, they could get rid of about 2/3 of their CPAs, and we wouldn't have people running across the pond to invert for a tax code. We could lower the tax code tremendously.
Just one follow-up. The report also takes aim at health savings accounts and the mortgage deduction, two popular tax breaks for middle-class families. What's the
It's
problem?
not true. It's not. The mortgage tax deduction isn't for middle-class families. 70% of it go to people making more than $250,000 a year. So we say that, but if you look at the people who actually get it, it's not middle class in this country. It's the upper middle class and the lower upper class that get 70% of the benefit of the mortgage deduction. So we hear that said all the time, and when you get a chart from finance, they'll show that chart so that it looks that way. But when you break it out, that's not true. And so all I'm saying is let's make it fair to everybody. And let's make the benefit of the mortgage tax deduction equal to everybody. So that if you have a small home in the middle of Oklahoma, let's make your mortgage deduction as far as a benefit to your tax rate the same as if somebody that has the average home here in Virginia benefit to their tax rate. All I'm saying is we're raising the questions, and the assumption, just like the assumption you just made, that it's the middle class tax cut. It's not. It is for upper middle income and lower upper income. The vast majority of people do not get a great benefit from the mortgage deduction. But the brokers do, and the real estate agents do, because they think they won't sell unless they've got that subsidy there to be able to claim that deduction.
Hi, Senator. Jim McTagg from Barron's Investment Magazine. I read the executive summary, and in it you found a note of clinical detachment. In that, you criticize conservative Republicans for their opposition to tax preferences. Can you give us some ideas of the tax preferences that they are opposing that you think are not logical opposition in light of the condition of the tax code?
You mean specifically?
Yeah.
I don't want to name one specifically. What I would say is if you really want to clean up the tax code, and you really want to make a fair tax system, and you really want us to grow, and I'm not talking about the government growing, I'm talking about the economy growing, then the best thing to do in the world is to sunset this tax code as of July 1st of this year and say it goes away, and then start with a fresh look with transition policies with that fresh look. And then make everybody that's scampering around town that's lobbying to keep their special interest in, the well-connected and the well-heeled, make them justify why that's a better deal than free market capitalism and letting capital flow where it'll get the best return. Remember, right now with our tax code, what happens is capital doesn't get invested based on the best return, which means jobs don't get created to the greatest amount, which means wealth doesn't get created to the greatest amount. Capital gets invested on what the net tax effect is on the investment, not on what the net wealth creation is for America. And well, that's crazy. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. So what we ought to do is we ought to put a death spiral on this tax code and say it ends now. You've got till then to come out and write a new tax code, whether it be a flat tax or a national sales tax or some combination. We've got this, in terms of corporate, we've got this transition golly molly gob, but we could write transition rules and we could get our economy really growing.
No. I had in mind the carried interest deduction. How do you feel about that?
Well, I've said it in there. I think carried interest is ordinary income. I don't think it's capital gains at all.
And how do you spell
But
that?
but that's me. And I said when I started this, these are my opinions. That let the Congress decide. But the fact is it's pretty hard. I'd love to get in a debate with anybody on that, on whether or not that, if they had real capital at risk, let it be capital. But if they don't have their own capital at risk, it's not capital gains. So I'll debate that with somebody. But I think carried interest is ordinary income.
Also, you used a word I never heard before. What's golly molly something? How do you spell that?
It's probably not a word.
Can we ask you some of the other things here?
Well, now wait, I'm going to finish on the taxes. This is about taxes, and then we'll talk about the other.
You mentioned the extender package. Can you preview your voting plans?
Yeah, my voting plan is to vote against it.
Procedurally, would you do anything to?
Everything I can.
following up very briefly on that, apparently there's a package of 3 charitable extenders that they want to make permanent, and they're going to try to UC it over here. Will you block that?
I'll have to look and see what they are.
Uh,
I'll give you an answer when I've looked at it.
Sure.
All right, it's your turn.
Yeah, thanks so much. Francine Kiefer from the Christian Science Monitor. I'm looking forward to the next Congress and wondering what advice you might have if you were doing an orientation for the freshman senators coming in. What, based on your own experience, your own class through here, what advice you might give them for coming into this Congress, the next one?
Oh, you're kind of stepping on my closing speech a little bit.
Well, then give me a piece of it.
I'd say the thing that ought to reign is the Constitution. Not what party leaders want. Not even what your electorate wants. Well, the reason I think our country is in trouble, and I really think it's in trouble, much more trouble than when I came here, is because we've abandoned the very tenets that made us successful. And I believe the enumerated powers are so routinely ignored in this body. I mean, they were pretty well destroyed between 1937 and 44 under the Roosevelt tutelage and then the Johnson tutelage. But they need to be reestablished because we can't run this government. Nobody can run this government today. And so I think paying attention to the Constitution and really studying what the founders and what they had to say about the enumerated powers and why it's important. And the reason it's important, the reason we have all this fraud, I mean, the reason there's $100 billion worth of fraud in Medicare is because it's run from here. The reason we have $400 billion worth of fraud in the federal government a year is because it's not that people aren't trying to manage it. It's too big to be managed. You can't do it. And so moving government closer to people makes government more effective, more responsive, and the thing you're seeing now gives people more confidence in their government because there's a real crisis of confidence right now. And we see it across all ethnic groups. We see it associated with the Justice Department, and we see it with all sorts of things. So my advice is I think the Constitution ought to reign supreme. And I think you ought to support the tradition, long-held traditions of the Senate, which I think have not been done, which allows everybody to have a voice, but they're big boys and girls, and when you lose, and you move on down the road. But to not vote and to not offer amendments and to not be able to speak in favor or against things and represent what you think to be accurate goes against the very idea of the creation and formation of a bicameral body, and specifically the Senate.
Senator Coburn. So in the next 48 hours or so, we're going to get this interim spending bill, presumably from the House. What do you expect to do when it comes to the immigration portion of it? And are you going to fight on the floor to be?
I haven't thought about the immigration portion of it yet. Haven't even been looking. I've been looking at the NDAA right now with all the junk that's been added to it. That's where my first fight's going to be.
What will your fight be on the NDAA?
Well, we spent Carl Levin and I spent a year looking at the parks. We did a study. We looked at it, and then I ended up putting out a report called Park. And we looked at how Congress continues to violate the rules of establishing parks. We looked at the $12 to $14 billion backlog in the parks just to maintain the pristine parks like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. I mean, they're falling apart. And then to look at, we're going to put 650-some thousand acres more, take the individual property rights away from Americans in this NDAA. No notice, no nothing, forever, can't touch or do things with your property. It's your property, but we're going to limit your ability to do things with it in terms of the land, some of the land designations. So my deal is if you want to put a lands bill on the floor, put a lands bill on the floor. Let's have a debate on the land bill. But for the defense authorization bill to have this kind of mess in it, and there's some good things in it, I'm not opposed to all of them, But the fact is, it's a hog going to, hog bill going to the trough with everybody getting something on, so everybody, it's gonna pass. But I'm gonna make the point it shouldn't.
But that said, we're back to the spending bill here. I mean, that's, you know, there is a drop dead date on this, 11/59, Thursday night. You know, there has to be, I mean, and if there is gonna be those who.
There's not drop deads, they always do, you know, if they need to do 2
Well,
days, 3 days.
Well, I know, would you object to that? I mean, still.
No, look, I haven't done, like I told you, I haven't spent my time looking at the spending bill yet, and I will. But right now, the first thing coming up my way is the NDAA. What I'm told in there, I don't know that the spending bill's come out of the House yet, has it?
No, it's gonna be posted this afternoon.
Well, maybe,
That's what they told me less than an hour ago.
yeah. Well, they told you that before and they haven't been right. So let's
Well, they
see.
told me yesterday they wouldn't put it out yesterday.
So I don't know. So I'll look at it and I'll comment on it when I'm prepared to make an intelligent comment. Right now, I'm not. All right. Good night. Happy holidays.
Thank you.